Hello, I'm Mark Wallace and I'm a Chartered Tax Advisor working for Walter Wright. We're an accountancy firm based in Hadley in Suffolk. This presentation will look at the CIS VAT reverse charge rules that are coming into force in March 2021. This presentation will cover three questions. What is the new VAT charge mechanism? Why does it apply? And also, when does it apply? I've also recorded two other presentations that will explain how you apply the rules in your business. One will look as if you're a subcontractor, the other if you're a contractor. So, what is the VAT reverse charge rules? What are they? Well, put simply, it's a new way of accounting for VAT if you're receiving or if you're supplying building construction services from the 1st of March 2021. Now, if you're used to CIS for income tax or corporation tax, you'll be aware that the scheme is quite complex, that the CIS scheme is something that a lot of people struggle to understand. Unfortunately, the definitions used for the CIS are also used for the VAT reverse charge mechanism system. And so you'll have to have a look at the guidance in order to understand whether the work is caught. So what will happen is, at the moment, before 1st of March 2021, if Bob the Builder raises a VAT invoice, he will raise the VAT invoice and charge VAT to the contractor. The contractor will then reclaim the VAT. After the 1st of March 2021, Bob the Builder won't charge VAT, and then the subcontractor will just raise an invoice with no VAT on it. The contractor, however, he will pay the VAT over to HMRC, but also he will reclaim the VAT from HMRC. So overall, there is no VAT cost to the contractor. Why has this scheme been introduced? Well, it's been introduced in order to stop VAT fraud. HMRC have become aware of the fact that there are gangs going around raising VAT invoices to contractors. The contractors reclaiming VAT because they think it's a legitimate invoice, but perhaps the subcontractor, for one reason or another, not paying the VAT over to HMRC, either because they're putting invoices through and reclaiming VAT which they shouldn't be, or alternatively they're walking off with the money, leaving a shell company with with nobody to pay the money over to the government, commonly referred to as missing fraud traders. So when does the VAT reverse charge rules apply? When do they come in? Well, there's 5 questions you have to ask, and if the answer to any of these questions are no, then the VAT reverse charge mechanism doesn't apply. So question 1, ask yourself, if you're the subcontractor, is the contractor registered for CIS? The idea being is that this transaction between the subcontractor and the contractor is covered by CIS, and so if you check whether the contractor is registered for CIS, or they should be registered for CIS, that means that the transaction may well be caught and you have to apply the VAT reverse charge rules. So the second question is, are both parties in the transaction registered for VAT? Now, the whole purpose of these rules is to ensure that VAT is paid across to HMRC. So if the subcontractor wasn't registered, then there'd be no reason to apply these rules. Conversely, if the contractor isn't registered for VAT, then the VAT is not going to be paid across to HMRC. So in order for the VAT reverse charge mechanism to work, both parties have to be registered for VAT. We're quite used to advising people to check out the VAT registration details of their customers, because if you reclaim VAT and from a customer and they're not bona fide registered with HMRC, maybe a fictitious VAT number, then HMRC can come to you and reclaim that VAT from you. But now, in future, if you're in the building sector, the subcontractor will also have to check out the VAT registrations of the contractor. So an action point: do you know that your customer is VAT registered if you're a subcontractor? Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, the VAT reverse charge rules will only apply if the transaction is subject and reportable to HMRC underneath the CIS regime. So you have to ask yourself, is your contractor registered for CIS? And also, if they are, does the supply fall within CIS? Because it may be the contractor is registered for CIS, but there's no need to report the transaction under the CIS. HMRC in their guidance gives some examples. So for example, as you see on this slide here, if you're doing groundworks, then CIS reverse charge mechanism applies. If you're altering buildings, constructing buildings, it applies. If you're installing heating and power supply systems at controllers, if you're doing internal and external painting and decorating, then the VAT reverse charge system applies. They also give us some examples of where it doesn't apply. Now, some of them may be a little bit extreme, but nonetheless, they talk about professional services, architects and surveyors. That VAT charge doesn't apply there in that case. If you're repairing the building and itself and things within the building, then again the VAT reverse charge does not apply. One area you need to be aware of is if you're supplying services of building or people, for example plumbers or builders to building companies. The VAT reverse charge does not apply if you're supplying the services of staff or temporary workers and you're an employment business. So what this means is that if you've got people that you're employing and you're charging their time across to building companies for their use, then the reverse charge doesn't apply. If, however, they're under your control and you're saying, this is the site I want you to go to, and this is how you do your work, these are the hours you work, then in that case you are providing the building services to the other party, and therefore the reverse charge mechanism may apply. There's a lot of detail in the guidance from HMRC, and I'd recommend you to have a look at that if you think that you may be falling within these rules for employment businesses. The reverse charge mechanism is slightly different to how you account for CIS for income tax and corporation tax purposes. You'll be aware if you're a contractor or subcontractor that you can either be a gross registered subcontractor or a net registered subcontractor. You'll also be aware that when you send out your invoice as a subcontractor, you can split your charges between labour and materials, and the CIS deductions, if they apply, will only apply to the labour element. That doesn't work like that when it comes to the VAT reverse charge mechanism. It's either all subject to the reverse charge or not. So it doesn't matter whether you supply labour only or whether you supply materials with a bit of labour, you'll apply the VAT recharge mechanism to the entire supply, the entire invoice. That may mean that you have to apply it for slightly differently for income tax or corporation tax purposes. HMRC give the example of Sean, the subcontractor, who's an all-rounder, and he does two things for Bob the builder. He repairs a radiator, which isn't building work, and he paints a window frames, which is building work. And then he issued an invoice for 1 job. Now, if this was CIS, then you would perhaps have income tax deducted from the work carrying it out for painting the window frames, but not the repairing the radiator. But HMRC say that because he's issuing 1 invoice to the same person, and it's the 1 contract, the reverse charge rules apply to the entire item and not just the building work. So question 4, after you considered those first 3 questions, is the supply reduced rated or standard rated? So would you be charging VAT normally at 5% or 20%? If the answer to that question is yes, then the VAT reverse charge mechanism applies. If the answer is no, it would be 0 rated, then you don't worry about that. And if you think about it, that's a sensible thing, because what would the contractor put on his return? Well, it would be charging no VAT and reclaiming no VAT. So So what about a situation where perhaps you have a contractor and subcontractor working on a number of different contracts? Perhaps they're building a house and it's a big construction company. Do you have to look at each contract every single time you raise an invoice? Well, the answer to that in theory is yes. But what HMRC have said is that if there's already been a supply caught by the reverse charge service rules between two parties, as long as you agree, any other supplies on that site can be treated as a reverse charge. I think the idea being is they're thinking, well, if you're doing it once, then the likelihood is you're probably going to be like doing it again on the same site. One question that you have to also ask is the customer an end user? Now, this is a term which is new to the VAT legislation and something that not many people have come across before. And I'll explain to you in the next few slides what an end user is. Now, what does it mean? Well, an end user is somebody who receives building supplies and construction services, but doesn't pass those on to somebody else. A good example is a property developer. A property developer may have building services supplied to them for two purposes. One may be that they're buying in the service and then selling the property on. Now that means that they wouldn't be an end user. But what if that company was building their own offices? They wouldn't be selling their offices on. They would be using the offices for their own purposes. And so in that case, that second example, they would be an end user. So the end user is really anybody who is using the services for their own business and not passing them on. Also, you need to be aware that underneath CIS, some businesses can be counted as contractors, even if they're not passing it on. So for example, large retailers around the country that have lots of shops, they might have lots of works done to their properties. They're not actually supplying any building supplies. They're not supplying. You don't go into WH Smith's and buy a house from them, but they're actually caught by CIS. Well, they're an end user because those repairs are being done to their property. It's not being passed on to anybody else. If you do work for local authorities and public bodies, the likelihood is that they will be end users. If you're doing work for some of the utility companies, perhaps working on some of their drains or whatever, again, that would be they would probably be an end user. So how do you know if you're working with an end user? Well, HMRC says that you can include a statement in your contract that says, well, assume that you're not an end user unless you say you're not. However, HMRC have said that that statement needs to have to be agreed with in writing. You can't say to somebody, here's the contract, and just rely on it. You need to have it agreed to in writing by the other party. But perhaps more simply, what you should really do as an end user, if you're the contractor, is you should notify the supplier that they are an end user. Another term is if they're an end user or whether they're an intermediary supplier. The rules are quite complex on this, and I haven't got time to go into that, but basically an intermediary is someone who supplies an end user. So it could be where, for example, that the subcontractor is working for XYZ and XYZ is immediately selling those services on to Z Limited. Now, if those two companies are linked, if they're the same company group, for example, or if, for example, they might be landlord and tenant, then they are linked. And therefore the intermediary supplier can say, I'm supplying the end user, and therefore any services that I receive are subject to the VAT in the normal way rather than the VAT reverse charge. When does it apply from? Well, I mentioned it at the start, 1st of March 2021. Now with construction services, they have special rules to determine the tax point, which is when VAT applies. It's basically when the VAT is raised, or the VAT invoice is raised, or alternatively when the supplier's payment is received by the supplier. Now that will mean essentially that most construction services that are paid for after the 1st of March 2021 will be caught by the new rules. Unless of course it's a one-off contract, in which case the tax point is moved to when the service is actually performed and finished, unless of course there's payment. But as a general rule, the new rules will come in place from the 1st of March 2021, and any payments or invoices raised after that date. What about retentions? It's common in the construction industry for there to be retentions. Well, the tax point for retentions is always when the payment is received or the VAT invoice is issued. So if you had a contract that was done in, let's say, December 2020, and you raised VAT in the normal way at the normal rates, but the retention paperwork is not sorted out until, let's say, May 2021, the subcontractor would be correct in charging VAT on the invoice that was raised in 2020. But when it comes to the invoice in 2021, because it's a retention payment and it's after the 1st of March, then in that case it will be caught by the reverse charge rules and no VAT will be charged by the subcontractor. Self-billing is a bit of a problem as well, and there are rules in place that determine when the reverse charge mechanism applies. In very simple terms, if you account for the self-billed invoice and it goes in the customs system before the 1st of March 2021, you've got until the 1st of June 2021 to account for it underneath the normal rules, and then after that time the domestic reverse charge mechanism applies. What about adjustments? What about if you afterwards having a dispute about how much it's charged? Well, HMRC have got a concession that says basically if the customer can reclaim all the VAT, then there's no need for anybody to do anything at all. If you think about it, all just follows through. No need to raise credit notes, although you may need to on your accounting system to clear it down. But essentially there's no accounting to be done, as long as the customer can reclaim all of the VAT. If not, then the subcontractor has to raise a credit note, and then the contractor will have to make the appropriate adjustments on his VAT return. Thankfully, HMRC have said there'll be a light touch on VAT penalties for the first 6 months of the system. If you want to know a bit more information and see the detail, I've got the link here as to where to go to, and I'll put it in the notes on YouTube. And so with that, I'll just say thank you very much for listening. If you want to know how to account for it and look at the simple versions, then look at parts 2 and 3, which will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much for listening.